The drifting sentinel, the star, was dying. Captain Mira Cade had watched it for 3 weeks now, its light fading to a dull orange ember against the infinite black. Her warship, the Revenant, drifted in its shadow like a predator in tall grass, silent and still. Every system was powered down except the passive sensors and her private command console. The rest of her crew slept in stasis pods, their bodies suspended in chemical dreams while she kept the lonely vigil. She traced her finger along the holographic display, watching the small red signatures approaching from the outer system. 17 vessels, all of them marked with the distinctive energy signatures of the Korvath Dominion. Her lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Right on schedule," she whispered to the empty bridge. The Revenant was one of humanity's newest generation warships. On paper, it carried enough firepower to level a small moon. In reality, it carried something far more dangerous. A neural-linked command system that merged human consciousness with artificial intelligence, creating a weapon that could think, adapt, and remember. Every battle, every casualty, every moment of human determination was stored in its quantum core, accessible to those who knew how to listen. Mira knew how to listen. She'd been listening for 5 years. The alien signatures grew closer. She watched them move with the arrogance of apex predators, their formation tight and aggressive. They thought they were the hunters. Mira's orders had been clear. Let them think that. Let them scan. Let them probe. Let them believe they'd found easy prey. Her fingers danced across the controls, triggering the first phase of the protocol. Deep within the ship's core, systems that had never truly slept began to wake. Not all at once. Just enough to appear vulnerable, damaged, abandoned. "Captain!" The voice made her turn. Lieutenant Jax Brennan stood in the doorway, his dark hair disheveled from stasis, his uniform still unsealed at the collar. He shouldn't have been awake yet. The protocol called for her to face the initial contact alone. "Your pod's timer malfunctioned," she said, though they both knew it was a lie. He'd overridden it. Again. "Couldn't sleep," Jax said, moving to his station with practiced ease. "Bad dreams. The neural link." "Always." He settled into his chair, his hands already checking systems with the muscle memory of 1,000 simulations. "You shouldn't be alone for this, Mira." She wanted to argue, to send him back to stasis where he'd be safe from what was coming. But the truth was, she was grateful. 5 years of missions together had forged something between them that went beyond duty. Something neither of them had the courage to name out loud. "They're almost in scanning range," she said instead. 17 ships, Korvath heavy cruisers with full war complements. And us? Jax's eyes met hers, dark with understanding. Just one ship, drifting, damaged, irresistible. On the main display, the alien fleet slowed its approach. They were being cautious, which meant they weren't complete fools. But caution wouldn't save them from what the Revenant truly was. Somewhere in the darkness beyond their hull, Mira knew they were deploying sensor arrays, powerful scanners designed to strip away every secret a vessel might hold. Let them look, she thought. Let them see what they expect to see. "First contact in 90 seconds, Jax reported, his voice steady despite the tension she could see in his shoulders. Mira initiated the second phase. Throughout the ship, the neural network began its slow awakening. Not the crew, not yet, but the memories, the ghosts of soldiers who had died aboard other vessels. Their final moments recorded and preserved in the collective consciousness that humanity had learned to weaponize. The aliens would scan for metal and energy. They would find something far older. "They're hailing us," Jax said. Standard Korvath challenge. Probably expecting no response. "Give them nothing." Mira leaned back in her chair, her eyes fixed on the approaching fleet. Let them work for it. Through the passive sensors, she watched the alien flagship move forward, separating from its escorts. It was massive, easily 3 times the Revenant's size, its hull covered in weapons batteries that could tear through most human vessels like paper. "Most vessels. Lead ship is Commander Vexer's flagship," Jax said, pulling up the intelligence files. "Decorated warrior, 300 confirmed kills. He's led the Korvath expansion in this sector for the last decade." Mira studied the alien commander's profile. Tall, even by Korvath standards, with skin that looked like polished obsidian and eyes that glowed with bioluminescent fury. A predator who had never known defeat. "He's about to learn something new," she said quietly. The first scanning beam touched their hull, invisible to the naked eye but blazing across her sensors like a searchlight. Mira felt it through the neural link, a curious probing that tickled against her consciousness like fingers trailing across her spine. "Let's give them what they want," she whispered, and activated the third phase. Deep in the ship's core, something ancient stirred. The Revenant had been built on bones and memories, its quantum processors seeded with the consciousness of soldiers who had volunteered to become something more than human. They slept in the dark between missions, dreaming dreams of fire and war. Now they began to wake, scanning intensity increasing, Jax reported. His hands were steady on the controls, but she could see the slight tremor in his jaw. He felt it too, through his own neural link. The ship was alive and aware and watching. On the display, the alien fleet tightened its formation, sensing perhaps that something was wrong but unable to identify the threat. Their commander, Vexer, would be staring at his own screens right now, seeing the Revenant as damaged, vulnerable, alone. Mira closed her eyes and reached deeper into the link. She felt the ship around her, felt the memories stirring like a vast ocean of experience. Battle, death, victory, loss, human determination distilled into data and waiting to be unleashed. "They're going deeper," Jack said, tension creeping into his voice. "Another 30 seconds and they'll hit the neural core." "Good," Mira whispered. "Let them see what we really are." Across the void, aboard the Korvath flagship, she imagined technicians staring at impossible readings. Systems that shouldn't exist, energy signatures that made no sense. And beneath it all, if they listened carefully enough, they might hear the first whispers. Human voices speaking from the dark. The trap was set. Now came the interesting part. Mira opened her eyes and smiled. "Welcome to our web," she said to the stars. Whispers in the dark, aboard the Korvath flagship Sovereign Talon, Commander Vexer stood before the viewing screen with his arms crossed behind his back. His obsidian skin reflected the pale light of distant stars, and his luminescent eyes narrowed as he studied the human vessel. "Report," he commanded, his voice resonating through the bridge like distant thunder. Thora, his lead technician, worked at her station with quick, precise movements. Her smaller frame and silver-streaked skin marked her as one of the science caste, often overlooked by warriors but invaluable in moments like these. She had served under Vexer for 20 cycles, long enough to know when to speak and when to remain silent. "Initial scans show extensive damage to their primary systems," she said carefully. "Hull breaches on decks 4 through 7. Power output at minimal levels. No active weapon signatures. Life signs?" Thora hesitated, her fingers hovering over the controls. "Difficult to determine. Their hull composition interferes with our bioscanners. I'm reading traces. Possibly a skeleton crew in stasis." Vexer's eyes gleamed brighter. A human warship, adrift and damaged, its crew sleeping. The intelligence value alone would justify the 3-month hunt through this forsaken sector. The Korvath Dominion needed to understand these aggressive newcomers who had appeared in their space like a plague. "Deploy deep scan arrays," Vexer ordered. "I want to know everything. Their weapons capabilities, their propulsion systems, their weaknesses." "Commander," Thora's voice carried a note of concern. "Perhaps we should exercise caution. The humans have proven unpredictable." Young Nexus, barely past his second molting, looked up from his console with the eagerness of inexperience. "They're just one ship, Technician Thora. Damaged. What threat could they pose?" Vexer appreciated the youth's confidence, even if it bordered on foolishness. "Proceed with the scan." Thora's fingers moved across her controls, and powerful sensor beams lanced out from the Korvath fleet, converging on the human vessel. Vexer watched the data stream across his displays, each new reading confirming what he already believed. The humans were advanced, yes, but not beyond understanding. Then something changed. "Commander," Thora said, her voice tight. "These readings, they don't make sense." "Explain." "The ship's internal structure keeps shifting. Not physically, but the scans show different configurations each time we pulse the sensors. It's as if the vessel is—" She trailed off, searching for words. "Is what?" Vexer demanded. "Hiding something." Aboard the Revenant, Mira felt the alien scan intensify through the neural link. It was like being watched by 1,000 eyes, each one probing, searching, trying to understand. The ship's AI, merged with the consciousness of fallen soldiers, responded with subtle defensive measures, shifting internal configurations to confuse the sensors. "They're persistent," Jack said beside her. He'd moved his chair closer during the last few minutes, close enough that their shoulders almost touched. Neither of them acknowledged it. Vexer doesn't take failure well, Mira replied, studying his profile. Intelligence says he's destroyed 3 civilian colonies rather than retreat without victory. Then we'd better make sure he learns his lesson here. She turned to look at him fully. In the dim light of the bridge, with only the glow of their consoles illuminating his face, Jax looked younger than his 28 years. They'd met at the academy, 2 ambitious officers who'd somehow ended up assigned to the most experimental ship in the fleet. "Jax," she said quietly, "if this goes wrong, it won't. But if it does." She reached out, her hand finding his in the space between their chairs. His fingers closed around hers, warm and solid. "I need you to know that these 5 years, serving with you, it's been—" "Mira." His thumb traced circles on her palm. "I know. I've always known." For a moment, they simply held each other's gaze, letting the weight of unspoken words fill the silence. Then the ship pulsed around them, a reminder of what they'd become part of, and they broke apart. "Scanning intensity increasing," Jax reported, though his voice was rougher now. "They're hitting the neural core." "Let them see," Mira whispered, and opened herself fully to the link. Nexus was the first to hear it. A whisper, so faint he thought it was his imagination. He tilted his head, his sensory organs twitching as he tried to isolate the sound. Nothing on his console indicated audio transmission, yet he heard it clearly now. "Stop watching." He looked around the bridge. No one else seemed to notice. Thora was focused on her screens, her face tight with concentration. Commander Vexer stood rigid, demanding more power to the scanners. The other crew members worked at their stations, oblivious. "Stop watching us." Nexus's hands began to tremble. The voice was human, he was certain of it, though he'd never heard human speech before. Yet somehow, impossibly, he understood the words as if they'd been spoken in his native tongue. "Did anyone else?" he started to say, but his voice died in his throat. Thora suddenly gasped, her hands flying to her head. "Commander!" "I'm receiving something, not through the comms. She stumbled back from her console, her eyes wide. "They're in my mind." Vexer spun toward her. "Explain." But Thora couldn't explain. Images flooded her consciousness, vivid and terrible. She saw human soldiers, their faces streaked with blood and dirt, fighting with a ferocity she'd never witnessed. They died and died again, but each time they fell, another took their place, driven by something beyond survival. Beyond reason. Determination. Pure, undiluted, terrifying determination. "Make it stop," she whispered, tears streaming down her silver face. Nexus felt it too now. The whispers grew louder, multiplying into a chorus. Hundreds of voices, thousands, all speaking at once. Some screamed, some laughed. Some simply stated facts with cold precision. "You are trespassing. You do not belong. We died for this. We died so you would fear. Shut down the scanners," Vexer commanded. But Thora was on her knees now, and Nexus found his hands wouldn't obey. The voices had wrapped around his mind like chains. Around the bridge, other crew members began to react. One fell from his chair, convulsing. Another stood frozen, staring at nothing, her mouth moving soundlessly. A third clawed at his own face, trying to block out visions that came from inside. Vexer felt it himself then, a pressure against his thoughts, pushing, probing. He was a warrior, trained to resist mental attacks, but this was unlike anything he'd encountered. These weren't thoughts being forced into his mind. These were memories. He saw a human city burning, saw ships tearing through the atmosphere, saw a young human soldier, barely more than a child, charging toward certain death with a weapon in trembling hands. The soldier died, and Vexer felt that death, felt the final moment of consciousness fading, felt the last thought. For humanity. By the void, Vexer breathed. Thora managed to raise her head, her face streaked with tears, and something that looked like blood from her sensory organs. "Commander, please." "We have to stop. This isn't a ship. It's a tomb, a memorial. It's alive with everyone who's ever died aboard it." "Impossible," Vexer said, but his voice lacked conviction. Nexus suddenly convulsed, his back arching. When he opened his mouth, the voice that emerged wasn't his own. It was human, female, young. "You came looking for weakness," the voice said through Nexus's lips. "You found strength. You came looking for secrets. You found ghosts. We are the Revenant, And we do not forget. The young Korvath collapsed, gasping. Thora crawled toward him, checking his vital signs with shaking hands. Vexer stared at the human warship on his screen. It still hadn't moved, still hadn't powered weapons, still hadn't done anything except exist. Yet his crew was falling apart around him. "Reduce scanner power," he ordered, pride warring with pragmatism in his voice. "Pull back to minimum range. Commander," one of his officers started. "Do it," Vexer roared. As the scanner beams weakened, the voices in their minds quieted slightly, becoming whispers again instead of screams. But they didn't disappear. They never disappeared. Thora could still hear them, a constant murmur at the edge of her thoughts. She looked at Vexer, and for the first time in 20 cycles of service, she saw fear in her commander's eyes. "What are they?" she whispered. Vexer had no answer. He'd fought countless species, conquered dozens of worlds, but he'd never encountered an enemy that could weaponize memory itself, that could turn the dead into soldiers who fought forever. On his screen, the human warship pulsed once, faint blue light tracing along its hull like veins. And Vexer finally understood they weren't scanning the humans. The humans were scanning them. The price of knowledge deep within the Revenant, in a section of the ship that existed in both physical and quantum space, Dr. Helena Voss opened her eyes. The medical bay around her hummed with the particular frequency of bio-neural systems coming online, a sound that most people couldn't hear but that resonated in her bones. She'd been dreaming of surgery. Not the clean, precise operations of her training, but the desperate battlefield medicine she'd practiced during the Proxima War. Hands slick with blood, working by emergency lighting while the ship shook apart around her, saving who she could, watching others slip away. Those memories weren't just hers anymore. They lived in the ship now, in the neural network that connected all of them. "Captain," she spoke into her comm, her voice still rough from stasis. "Medical bay online. I'm reading elevated stress markers across the neural link." "What's happening?" Mira's voice came back immediately. "We have visitors, Helena. Korvath, they're scanning us." "How deep?" "Deep enough to wake you." Helena understood. The ship's protocols were designed to awaken crew members based on threat assessment. If the medical officer was being roused, the ship anticipated casualties. Or worse. She moved to her central console, her fingers dancing across holographic displays that showed the ship's bio-neural status. What she saw made her breath catch. The network was fully active, burning bright with the consciousness of 3,000 soldiers who had died aboard humanity's warships over the last decade. Their memories, their experiences, their final moments, all of it merged into a collective awareness that the Revenant could weaponize. "Mira," Helena said carefully, "the neural load is approaching maximum capacity. If we push much harder, we risk feedback cascade. The ghosts are getting restless. Can you manage it?" Helena studied the readings, watching synaptic patterns flare and fade like neural lightning. "For now. But if they keep scanning, if they keep pushing, the ship might push back harder than we intend." On the bridge, Mira absorbed this information with practiced calm, though Jack saw the slight tightening around her eyes. They'd trained for this scenario, run simulations hundreds of times, but simulations never captured the weight of being responsible for both the living and the dead. "Helena, I need you to monitor Jax and me," Mira said. "Make sure we don't go too deep into the link." "Already on it," Helena replied. Through her medical console, she could see the neural patterns of both officers, watching as they interfaced with the ship's consciousness. It was like watching 2 drops of water trying not to dissolve into an ocean. Axe noticed Mira's hand tightening on her armrest. Without thinking, he reached over and covered it with his own. She didn't pull away. "We're in this together," he said quietly. She nodded, grateful for the anchor his touch provided. It was easy to lose yourself in the link, to become absorbed by the collective consciousness. Having someone to remind you of your individual self made all the difference. "Alien scanning intensity is fluctuating," Jax reported. "They reduced power briefly, but now they're ramping back up. Looks like their commander decided curiosity outweighs caution." "His mistake," Mira said. She closed her eyes, sinking deeper into the neural link. "Helena, I'm going to activate Protocol Phantom. Are you ready?" In the medical bay, Helena's hands moved swiftly across her controls. Protocol Phantom would allow the ship to project memories directly into the alien scanners, turning their own technology against them. but it required careful management. Push too hard, and they could permanently damage alien minds. Despite everything, humanity tried to maintain some ethical boundaries. "Ready when you are," Helena confirmed. Aboard the Sovereign Talon, Vexer made his decision. Retreat was not an option, not when they'd come this far. The whispers had quieted to bearable levels, and his crew was slowly recovering. Whatever mental attack the humans had launched, his people were warriors. They would endure. "Increase scanning power," he ordered. "Maximum intensity. I want their secrets laid bare." "Commander, please," Thora pleaded, still pale from her earlier experience. "We don't understand what we're dealing with. The human vessel isn't just technology. It's something else. All the more reason to learn everything we can." Vexer's eyes blazed brighter. "We cannot defeat an enemy we don't understand. Scan." Thora's hands shook as she increased the power. Around the bridge, other crew members braced themselves, some closing their eyes as if preparing for physical pain. The scanning beams intensified, drilling into the Revenant's hull with unprecedented strength. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the human warship pulsed and reality twisted. Nexus screamed first. Not words, just raw sound, his hands clutching his head as images slammed into his consciousness. He saw human history, millennia of warfare compressed into seconds. Tribes fighting with stones, armies clashing with steel, cities burning under nuclear fire, ships tearing through space leaving trails of destruction. But it wasn't just seeing, he felt it. Every death, every moment of human suffering and determination, every instance of a human refusing to surrender even when victory was impossible. The sheer weight of human experience crushed down on him, and he understood with terrifying clarity why they called themselves Homo sapiens, wise man, while simultaneously being the most violent species he'd ever encountered. They were wise enough to know they were violent. They embraced it, weaponized it, turned their own mortality into strength. Thora saw something different. She saw human love, parents dying to protect children, soldiers sacrificing themselves for comrades, scientists working until their last breath to save their species. And beneath it all, the terrible, beautiful truth. Humans formed such powerful emotional bonds that even death couldn't break them. That's what the Revenant was. A ship held together not by metal, but by the love and loyalty of those who died aboard vessels like it. All across the Korvath Bridge, crew members experienced their own visions. Some saw battles, some saw beauty, some saw the mundane daily life of humans, which somehow made them more terrifying. These weren't monsters. They were people. People who chose to fight, who chose to die, who chose to never give up. Vexer felt his own consciousness splitting. Part of him remained in his body, a warrior who'd killed for 300 years, but another part was drowning in human memory, experiencing a species that measured time not in cycles but in generations, that passed down stories and grudges and dreams from parent to child, creating a continuity that made each individual death simultaneously tragic and meaningless. He saw a human soldier, a woman with dark skin and determined eyes, fighting on the hull of a warship as it fell into a star. She knew she would die. Everyone knew. But she kept fighting anyway, kept firing her weapon at the enemy until the heat vaporized her, and her last thought was pride that she'd bought her comrades 3 more seconds. 3 seconds. That's what a human life was worth to them. 3 seconds for a friend. Vexer's legs buckled. He caught himself on his command chair, breathing hard. Around him, his crew had collapsed. Some were unconscious. Others rocked back and forth, weeping or laughing or making sounds that had no meaning. Nexus lay on the floor, his eyes open but seeing nothing, his mind lost somewhere in the human consciousness that had overwhelmed him. Only Thora remained partially functional, though tears streamed from her eyes and her hands wouldn't stop shaking. "Commander," she whispered, "we have to stop. Please, we're not strong enough for this." No one is. On the Revenant, Helena watched the bio-neural displays with growing concern. The ship's consciousness was burning white-hot, feeding on the aliens' intrusion, growing stronger with each moment. Mira and Jax were still connected, their own neural patterns fluctuating dangerously. "Mira, you need to pull back," Helena said urgently. "You're going too deep." But Mira couldn't hear her. She was lost in the link, experiencing what the aliens were experiencing, feeling their fear and confusion. And beneath that, something else, curiosity, respect, the beginning of understanding. Jax felt her slipping away. In the link, their consciousnesses were intertwined. and he could sense her getting lost in the collective. Without thinking, he stood and moved to her chair, kneeling beside it so he could look directly into her unfocused eyes. "Mira," he said firmly. "Come back." She didn't respond. Her hand, which had been gripping his earlier, now hung limp. He did the only thing he could think of. He pulled her face toward his and kissed her. It was brief, desperate, an anchor thrown into stormy seas. But it worked. Mira's eyes focused, finding his face just inches away. For a moment, surprise flashed across her features. Then she grabbed the front of his uniform and kissed him back, hard and fierce, a reminder that they were alive and individual and human. When they broke apart, both breathing hard, she whispered, "That was highly unprofessional, Lieutenant. File a complaint later, Captain." His grin was shaky but genuine. "Right now we have aliens to terrify." Helena's voice cut through their moment. Neural load stabilizing. "Good work, Jax. Now both of you pull back before the ship decides it doesn't need pilots anymore." They did, carefully extracting themselves from the deepest levels of the link while maintaining enough connection to control the ship's responses. It was delicate work, like walking a tightrope while the rope tried to absorb you. "How are they doing?" Mira asked, her eyes on the alien fleet. "Falling apart," Jax reported. "Most of their crew is incapacitated. Their scanning power is dropping. I think they're trying to retreat." Mira studied the displays. Part of her, the part that lived in the link and remembered every human who died fighting the Korvath, wanted to press the advantage. Wanted to break them completely. But she was still human. Still herself. Still the woman who'd kissed Jax and felt something real and individual and worth protecting. "Let them pull back," she said quietly. "But not too far. We're not done teaching them yet." The Revenant pulsed once more, a heartbeat in the dark, and the aliens felt it in their bones. The hunter becomes prey. The Sovereign Talon limped backward through space, its engines firing erratically as terrified crew members struggled to maintain control. Vexor remained standing through sheer force of will, his luminescent eyes dim to near darkness. Around him, the bridge looked like a battlefield after the fighting had ended. Crew members sprawled across consoles, some still twitching as human memories echoed through their minds. Thora had managed to pull herself to her station, though her silver-streaked face was now entirely silver, drained of all color. Her fingers trembled as she tried to shut down the scanning arrays, but the systems weren't responding properly. The human ship had done something to them, infected them somehow. "Commander," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Our systems, they're compromised. I'm seeing code that I didn't write, algorithms that are rewriting our databases. The humans are inside our computers." Vexor's blood ran cold. A physical attack he could understand, could fight. But this? This was warfare on a level the Korvath had never imagined. The humans hadn't just defended themselves. They'd invaded, turned the Korvath's own technology into a weapon against them. "Isolate the affected systems," he ordered. "Cut them off from the primary network." "I'm trying." But Thora's screen flickered and human text appeared, stark white against the darkness. "You scanned us. Now we scan you. Krill." Vexor's second officer pulled himself to his feet using the tactical console. His voice was rough, traumatized. "Commander, recommend immediate withdrawal. Full retreat to the outer system." "We need to break contact before what?" Vexor snapped. "Before we admit that one human vessel defeated an entire Korvath fleet without firing a single shot. Before we return home and confess that we fled from ghosts and whispers. Yes." Krill's voice rose, something unthinkable for a subordinate officer. "Exactly that. Because pride is worthless to the dead, Commander. I've seen what they are now. What they can do. These humans don't just fight wars. They win them. Even in death, they win them." Vexor wanted to strike him, to reassert his authority through violence as Korvath tradition demanded. But he couldn't, because Krill was right. Every instinct Vexor possessed, honed through 3 centuries of warfare, screamed at him to run. He looked at the human warship on his screen. It still hadn't moved. Still hadn't activated weapons. Yet somehow it dominated the battlefield more completely than any vessel he'd ever faced. "Thora," he said quietly, "what are our weapons' status?" She checked, though he could see from her expression that she already knew the answer. "Offline, all of them. Targeting computers are locked. Fire control systems aren't responding. It's as if..." She trailed off. "As if what?" "As if they're waiting for permission. From the humans. The bridge fell silent except for the moans of injured crew members. Nexus had regained consciousness but couldn't speak, could only stare at nothing with eyes that had seen too much. Another technician, an older female named Sivra, rocked back and forth in her chair, whispering human words none of them should understand. "Remember us. Remember us. Remember us." Vexor made his decision. "All ships, prepare for emergency." The Revenant moved. It happened so fast that their sensors barely registered it. One moment the human warship was drifting, inert. The next, it had closed half the distance between them, its engines flaring with power that bent space itself. No ship should move that fast. No ship should be able to fold space without spending hours calculating the jump coordinates. But the Revenant wasn't just a ship anymore. It was something else. Evasive maneuvers. Vexor roared, but his helmsman couldn't respond. The man's hands were locked on his controls, unable to move, his eyes wide with terror as whispers filled his mind. The Revenant stopped directly in front of them, close enough that they could see details of its hull. Close enough that the blue veins pulsing across its surface seemed to beat in time with their own hearts. Close enough to crush them if it chose. And then it spoke, not through communication systems, not through hacked computers. It spoke directly into their minds, every Korvath in the fleet hearing the same voice, a chorus of thousands speaking as one. "You wanted to know our secrets, now you will." On the Revenant, Mira felt the ship surge forward without her conscious command. The neural link had grown stronger, the collective consciousness more active. For a terrifying moment, she wasn't sure who was in control, her or the ship. "Mira!" Jax grabbed her shoulder, his touch pulling her back from the edge. "You're pushing too hard. Let me help." She looked at him, saw her own fear reflected in his eyes, and nodded. Together, they sank into the link, their individual consciousnesses merging with each other and the ship, creating a triumvirate of awareness that could better control the massive neural network. It was intimate in a way that physical touch could never be. Jax could feel her thoughts, her emotions, her memories. She could feel his steady presence, his quiet strength, his love. Yes, love, there was no hiding it in the link. For her. "I've got you," he whispered aloud, though in the link his voice was everywhere and nowhere. Together, they directed the ship's consciousness, channeling its power with more precision than Mira could have managed alone. The Revenant responded, its systems synchronizing with their combined will. Helena watched from the medical bay, monitoring their neural patterns with growing concern. They were deeper in the link than anyone had ever gone, their individual identities starting to blur into the collective. If they stayed too long, they might not be able to separate themselves again. "Mira, Jax," she said urgently, "you need to finish this, one way or another. You're burning out." "Almost done," Mira's voice came back, distant and strange. "Just need them to understand." Vexor felt the human consciousness slam into him like a physical force. Not memories this time, not visions. Pure information, compressed and distilled, downloaded directly into his brain. He saw humanity's history of warfare. Not the battles themselves, but the philosophy behind them. He understood their concept of acceptable losses, the cold mathematics by which they calculated how many of their own people they were willing to sacrifice for victory. He felt their fury at being attacked, their absolute refusal to surrender even when surrounded, and their terrifying willingness to die rather than live in chains. But more than that, he understood their capacity for mercy, saw instances where humans had spared defeated enemies, had rebuilt destroyed civilizations, had offered peace even to those who'd tried to exterminate them. Humans were capable of monstrous violence, yes, but also monstrous compassion, the choice of which side they showed you depended entirely on how you treated them. The information flood ended, leaving Vexor gasping. Around him, his crew experienced their own revelations. Thora saw human science, their relentless pursuit of knowledge even when it cost them everything. Krill saw human loyalty, the bonds of brotherhood that made their military so effective. Nexus, still barely functional, saw human love, romantic, familial, platonic, and understood that this, more than anything, was what made them dangerous. They fought for each other, not for abstract concepts of dominion or honor. The Revenant pulsed once more, and new text appeared on every Korvath screen. "Now you know. What will you do?" Vexor stared at the question, understanding its weight. The humans were giving him a choice. They could destroy his fleet right now, he knew that with absolute certainty. Their weapons were active, their systems operational. One word from their captain and the Korvath would cease to exist. But they were waiting, giving him the chance to retreat, to learn, to choose wisdom over pride. Thora's voice broke the silence. "Commander, please, they're not asking us to surrender. They're asking us to leave." "There's a difference." Vexer looked at his devastated crew, looked at the human warship, so close he could see his own reflection in its hull, looked at his own hands, still trembling from the information that had been forced into his mind. For 300 years he'd been a conqueror. But the humans had shown him something new, the difference between winning battles and winning wars. You could lose every battle and still win the war if you refused to stop fighting. The humans understood that in their bones. And right now Vexer understood that he'd already lost this war. Lost it the moment he'd decided to scan that ship. "All vessels," he said, his voice heavy with defeat and something else, perhaps respect. "Full retreat. Maximum speed. Break contact and return to the rendezvous point." "Commander," one of his officers started. "Now!" Vexer roared, and his crew obeyed. As the Korvath fleet began to withdraw, their damaged engines straining, Vexer sent one final message to the human vessel. Not through computers, but through thought itself, directed at whatever consciousness lived within that ship. "We understand now. We will remember this." The response came immediately, terrifying in its simplicity. "Good." Mira and Jax watched the alien fleet limp away, their combined consciousness still merged with the ship. They felt its satisfaction, its eagerness to pursue and finish the job. But they held it back, two individual wills asserting control over the collective. "Let them go," Mira said, her voice echoing in the link. "Are you sure?" Jax asked, sharing her thoughts. "They'll report back. They'll tell their people what we are." "Yes," Mira replied. "That's exactly what I want. Let them tell the galaxy that humanity doesn't start wars, but we finish them." Slowly, carefully, they began to extract themselves from the deep link. It was harder than entering had been, like pulling themselves out of quicksand. The collective consciousness didn't want to let go, wanted to keep them, to make them part of the eternal memorial it had become. But Jax held Mira's hand in physical space, and she held his, and together they used that connection, simple, human, individual, to pull themselves back to who they were. When they finally broke free, both gasping as if surfacing from deep water, Helena was already there with medical monitors, checking their vital signs. "That," Helena said firmly, "was incredibly stupid. Your neural patterns almost merged permanently with the ship. You could have lost yourselves." "But we didn't," Jax said, his hand still holding Mira's. "Because we had each other." Mira looked at him, really looked at him, seeing him clearly for the first time since they'd entered the link. In that shared consciousness, she'd felt everything he felt for her. Knew that he'd follow her into any danger, face any enemy, risk any sacrifice. Knew that she felt exactly the same way about him. "Lieutenant Brennan," she said formally, though her eyes were warm. "When this mission is over, we need to discuss our operational synchronization." He grinned, understanding her meaning perfectly. "Looking forward to it, Captain." Helena rolled her eyes. "You two are impossible. Get some rest. The ship can handle the aftermath." They did, making their way to the observation deck where they could watch the stars and the retreating alien fleet. Mira leaned against Jax, his arm around her shoulders, both of them too tired to maintain professional distance anymore. "Think they learned their lesson?" Jax asked quietly. Mira watched the alien ships disappear into the darkness. "They learned something. Whether it's the right lesson?" She trailed off. "Only time will tell," Jax finished for her. They stood in comfortable silence, two humans who'd touched something vast and terrible and beautiful, and had managed to remain themselves. For now, that was enough. Echoes of war. 3 days after the encounter, the Revenant remained on station near the dying star, running diagnostics and repairs while its crew recovered. Most of them had returned to stasis, but Mira, Jax, and Helena stayed awake to ensure the ship's neural network stabilized properly. In the medical bay, Helena reviewed the psychological profiles of the entire crew, paying particular attention to Mira and Jax. Their neural patterns had changed during the deep link, not dangerously, but noticeably. They were more synchronized now, their brain waves showing correlation patterns that typically only appeared in people who'd known each other for decades. "You two are bonded now," Helena said,